Hello, I'm Martin Oates. Coming up on the Sunday Politics in the South West, we'll be taking a look at new immigration figures for the region produced by the University of Oxford. And for the next 20 minutes, I'm joined by the Conservative MP Neil Parish, Labour MP Ben Bradshaw and the UKIP MEP Lord Dartmouth. Welcome back to three Sunday Politics veterans, in the case of one of them bearing his battle scars. First, the local government secretary Eric Pickles has unveiled a list of measures he says will end the war on drivers. Motorists will get a 10-minute grace period after their parking tickets expire before being fined. Local residents will be able to demand reviews of local parking policies. And councils have been reminded they're not allowed to use parking charges purely to generate profit. Neil, if councils are relying maybe too heavily on parking charges to raise revenue, is that because the government's squeezing all their other sources of revenue and their independence to generate it?
It's a good source of revenue, so I'm not knocking that. But I think, you know, the idea that people are hovering over your car, so the moment that the ticket expires, you get a ticket. I mean, I come back from a surgery in perhaps the middle of Tiverton. Somebody talks to me in the street, I can land up getting a parking ticket if I'm not careful. So I think that makes common sense. And then, of course, the parking as well is an issue because, of course, more people, whether we like it or not, have got more cars, and in lots of towns like Honiton and elsewhere, you actually need to review parking quite regularly so that the residents can park safely, but where they can. So I think, on the whole, I think it's quite a good idea. And councils will get used to having to deal with these new rules, and they just don't want to be quite so overzealous as they have been at the moment. Ben, you're, of course, a very well-known cyclist.
Yes,
Injury. What's the cyclist's perspective on this?
Well, it's not just a cyclist's perspective. I mean, I don't have a problem with this, as long as it doesn't lead to confusion and more kind of arguments between traffic wardens and motorists. And don't forget that, you know, in a way, traffic wardens have an important job to do. They are enforcing the parking rules to make sure that traffic is flowing freely and that high streets don't get clogged up with people parking illegally and overstaying their parking limit. My worry here is that, you know, if it's a half-hour limit, are we saying it's 40 minutes? Why just not make it 40 minutes? Rather than talk about vague grace periods? It would seem to me, if you have a limit, stick to it, but it's not something I feel particularly strongly about.
OK, Wiiliam, I think it's fair to say UKIP sees itself as the motorist friend, doesn't it?
Well, as a matter of fact, I actually hardly ever drive. No, I think that this is very sensible and way overdue. But there is quite an important point about parking restrictions, which is that heavy parking restrictions has made life much, much more difficult for shops on the high street. And we're seeing throughout the country, and to some extent in the southwest, a decline of the high street. And this has been compounded and exacerbated and made worse by very, very severe parking restrictions. So any relaxation is sensible and way overdue.
I think out-of-town shopping centres have had a far bigger impact.
Yeah, but we are talking about parking. We aren't talking about out-of-town shopping centres.
Yeah, I think the grace period will be very good.
OK, well, I think it's probably time to break this worrying consensus.
It won't last, I don't think. Mark.
Polls suggest that immigration will be an issue for many voters with the upcoming election. This week, our Inside Out programme was given exclusive access to new figures from Oxford University, estimating numbers of immigrants and where they'd settled since the 2011 census. In the wider southwest region, stretching up to Gloucestershire, the number of EU-born immigrants in 2011 was 179,000. The Oxford model suggests that's now risen to 189,000. Over the same period, the number of non-EU-born immigrants has risen from 218,000 to 238,000. Johnny Rutherford's been to talk to both migrant workers and employers in Plymouth.
This may look like a cafe, but it is in fact a recruitment and employment agency who provides 600 temporary workers a week to employers in the southwest. More than half of them are migrant workers.
I would very much say that the economy in the southwest, especially at the lower wage levels, is very dependent on migrant labour. Many people, especially if they have children, married, are stuck in a sort of benefits trap, and it's not easy for them to get into work and to make it pay. And a lot of what we do here is to work with people and show them how to get into work and the benefits of actually getting onto the first rung of the ladder and where that can lead, because that is a critical factor which a lot of people don't acknowledge.
And someone who has managed to step on that ladder is Bartosz Borowski. He works for Fine Tube's precision engineering company in Plymouth.
I'm over here about 10 years now in Fine Tubes. nearly 11 years in England. I started from the minimum wage. I was just general operator for the agency. Then I was employed by the fine tubes. As I said, step on the first step of the ladder and going way through the operator, senior operator, deputy, and up to the cell leader, where I am now.
The Fine Tubes company employs around 400 workers. 26% of them are Eastern European. So are they taking jobs away from the locals?
The local employment market and local people seem to be reluctant to come in at sort of the base wages that we would pay. Why that is, it's difficult to understand. You know, some projections may say it's more beneficial for them not to be working, but we don't seem to have those issues with the guys from the Eastern European countries.
I left Poland about 9 years ago with my parents. They came across here to find a better job than in Poland. If you try your best, you will get higher, yeah? So I think that's how the system works.
And Chris Leonard agrees that immigrant workers are vital to our present economy, but says the future requires more investment in home-born labour.
We just cannot attract enough people for these roles. And if it wasn't for migrant labour, we wouldn't be able to meet our clients' requirements for staff, and that's right across the region. So I can, I totally believe, having been there and seen it, that we need migrant labour in the southwest, and we probably need more. But the bigger and the longer term issue is actually to work with our people coming up into the employment market so that they are available and want to take the sort of jobs which are being offered by local employers.
Neil, we'll talk about the local figures, these estimates, in a minute. Last week, of course, there were some very embarrassing national figures for the government. David Cameron said immigration will be brought down to under 100,000 a year by this point in time. It's actually 3 times that. It's indefensible, isn't it?
Well, it's certainly proved to be very difficult, but I think what we've got to now concentrate very much on is we've got these workers coming in from the EU and elsewhere. Provided they're doing a good job of work, they're actually helping the economy. We've got to tighten much more on the benefit system and health service.
So there's no problem with this level of immigration? It's not a failure of the government's policy?
If you have run an economy which has created a lot of jobs, you are naturally going to be attractive. So therefore...
That's a contradictory argument, isn't it?
Yeah, but Martin, if you look, you take those firms there, they actually need labour. Now, we've also got to make sure our education system and everything else is working up on our own labour to make sure it takes that position. But unemployment is dropping all the time, so therefore people will come into this country and they will generate income. I think it's become a sort of fear of people that the immigration is the big issue.
Why promise this reduction? Because your government staked its political reputation on improving the economy. You said your long-term economic plan would actually have the economy in a better state by now, so this would have been inevitable, wouldn't it? So why say you bring immigration down by this totally unrealistic amount?
I mean, I think hindsight, is a marvellous thing, and I imagine if we could replay the record, we may not have got ourselves on a particular hook on the numbers, because I think what we have found has been very difficult. What we have put in place is clearly identifying who is coming in, so we actually know these figures much more than previous governments. But it is something that I think, it's a case of as Kennedy once says, don't ask what America can do for you, ask what you can do for America. And so that is what is key.
Yes or no, do you think there should be a pledge of a similar cap in future?
I think what we've got to do no is the answer.
Okay,
and I think we've got to concentrate on benefit claimants and on just automatic access to our health service. That's much safer ground.
OK. Ben, Labour's admitted to mistakes in handling immigration before. Looking at the list of policies you're talking about now, tighter border controls, cutting down on low-skilled labour, it sounds like the same stuff the Tories are saying, doesn't it?
Well, I don't have a problem with that, and in fact I agree with Neil, and I understand even UKIP now have abandoned the idea of a cap. I think the idea of a cap was completely ridiculous. I mean, in a free market, which we have in Europe, a single market, we benefit from British workers working abroad, moving abroad, living abroad, and as your film showed, many parts of the southwest economy would come to a grinding halt without a migrant labour, not least agriculture and the food sector, which is very dependent on migrant labour. So let's be realistic realistic about this and not pretend we can do something that's also not in the interests of our economy. But Neil's absolutely right. We have to upskill our own workforce through better skills and apprenticeships, and we do have to clamp down on the very tiny number of migrants who abuse the benefit system. Let's not pretend this is a huge problem. It's not. Most of the people who are coming here to work, and they work very hard.
I'm sure you're on the edge of your seat, Wiiliam, because you'll totally disagree. We heard, of course, that recruitment consultant there saying we need more immigrants.
Well, it's very simple. People, if there are short-term work shortages, you can have people in the country without giving them the right of permanent settlement. Now, many years ago, I qualified as a chartered accountant, and many years ago, there was a shortage of accountants in the United Arab Emirates. And I went to work in the United Arab Emirates on a 2-year contract, where, incidentally, my employer paid my health insurance and paid for my accommodation. And when the work shortage was over, the 2-year contract was over, I had to come home. And that is the basic point. Now, and that is something which is actually never mentioned. The other thing that doesn't get mentioned is that people in work are, of course, eligible for in-work benefits. It's not just work or benefits. There are in-work benefits. Now, I've got here a list of 9 in-work benefits, which I think is probably incomplete, which people are eligible for. But the context of this is very simple. In the Labour years, there was this experiment that took place whereby over 7 million people came to live permanently in the United Kingdom. And to be fair to the Labour Party, they apologised. Gordon Brown apologised, David Blunkett apologised. I haven't actually heard Ben Bradshaw apologise, but I'm sure he would apologise too. Now, in the 2010 general election, David Cameron promised that there would be a cap of 100,000. Now, we've just heard from Neil Parish that Mr Parish, and the Conservatives have got absolutely no interest in controlling immigration at all.
What I said,
and you see that this is confirmed in the... Well, everybody's heard this what you said.
Because, I mean, what are you saying? You haven't said anything about the cap yet, or any other...
Please, it's just confirmed in the figures. Non-EU immigration... Yes. which the government is able to control, has massively increased. It was 292,000. Now, finally, as someone who's been very critical of the BBC in the past, particularly on this coverage, I must praise BBC Southwest, because for once you've shown us the actual number of people who've immigrated and not net immigration. It's over 200,000.
It is an interesting point, isn't it, that the non-EU immigration, which the government can control, nothing we can do about movement within the EU, it's still...
Well, we would if we left.
That's very much why we're also looking at the exit controls as well, because I mean one of the problems we've had, and successive governments have had this, is that we monitor perhaps people coming in, but we never actually know whether they actually leave again. So there are issues there, and there are things that we can really tighten up on. But in the end, it comes down to this issue: if you've got a good economy, you will attract labour,
and that's a good thing.
It's not bad. Not as bad as it's painted, because I think very often it's painted here that all immigrants are bad for this country. No, they're not. And I think sometimes, and I might get the wrath of some people, sometimes we're seen as a country that has always been very open to people coming here to work. And if we're not careful, we're going to be seen actually as a country that's mean-minded. And that I don't want to do. We've got to be absolutely fair to let people in who are going to work hard and keep those people out that are going to claim benefit.
I want to ask you and Ben, you could say, look, we could have the people who are beneficial to the economy, the people we want to have, but we could say no to the people we don't want and who are a drain. Isn't that perfectly sensible?
I don't think it's very... By leaving the EU. In practice, it's quite difficult to do. I also think you'll find that quite a lot of people that come from the EU are actually going back again, because once they've made some money, they've worked hard in this country, they go back to Poland or wherever. I mean, the situation is that if you've got, and I say it again, if you compare ourselves to France and Spain and Italy, where unemployment is so high, you are bound to attract labour into this country.
So bringing immigration down. Ben, just quickly, this idea we have a points-based system like Australia.
Well, in practice, that's what we have for non-EU migrants already. You can't just come here. You do have to apply for the job, and the employer has to show they can't employ anyone else from within the EU to do it. So you already have that, and then you can't overstay your welcome. But in the single market, we get the benefits, and we get the benefits too. And what was interesting in your film, I thought, was actually how small the increase has been. We don't know how many of those people were students attracted to our wonderful higher education establishments like Exeter University.
OK, we've got to leave it there, I'm afraid. Now, if you want to see the figures from your local area, you can access a map showing a local breakdown at bbc.co.uk/insideout. Now, the challenge of providing services in rural areas is a familiar issue here in the southwest. This week, small village pharmacies were in the spotlight during a Commons debate. A government scheme which supports pharmacies comes to an end on the 31st of March, leaving some rural pharmacists wondering if their businesses can survive. Tamsin Melville reports.
St Maur's on the Roseland Peninsula, and the charms are obvious, but the cost of providing essential services to a very rural community like this come at a price. The village pharmacy has been here for around 70 years, but the future's uncertain. An extra £54,000 government cash it's been getting a year to help keep it open is under threat.
The impact of not receiving that money is that we may not be able to continue to provide pharmacy services in the future. The government really needs to assess the way they manage contracts. Small rural pockets of population still need pharmacy services, and they need to be funded adequately as well.
A petition has attracted hundreds of signatures, and for customers like David Grocott, the personal service on offer is a lifeline.
I take sometimes in excess of 22 tablets a day, and Faisal is very, very good. The service is excellent. If it's raining like it was yesterday, he delivered dressings for me. Or where else am I going to get something like that?
The pharmacy isn't alone in facing cuts to funds supporting rural services. This branch GP surgery in St Maur's is now shut one day a week because the government is phasing out a previous guarantee of a minimum amount of cash for practices regardless of the number of patients they have. Every year for 7 years, the practice is set to lose a further £7,000.
At the moment, I feel discriminated against as a rural doctor. You know, the agenda is very much for large multi-service practices in populated areas. It seems to be that that's the direction of travel, and that's not possible on my patch, really, or not unless you start to provide decent bus services.
The expense of running 1 main and 2 branch surgeries on the Roseland is helped by being a dispensing practice. Generating income, Dr Hines says, is crucial. With the pharmacy in St Maur's also needing business, both say they support each other and that it's a system that needs changing. But there's not a lot of optimism.
It's difficult really to believe any of the policies because the last government promised us there would be no reorganisation of the NHS, and it was immediately the first thing they did. So one has to remain quite disillusioned with politicians at present.
The government says both funding schemes were only ever meant to be temporary, and NHS England says it's looking at the results of a consultation on St Maur's pharmacy with the aim of securing the best possible outcome for local people. And it says the changes to the GP's funding mean money can be distributed more equitably across practices in the region, according to the number of patients.
Ben, I know Labour have been very critical of the government dropping this minimum support for GP surgeries, but not saying whether you would reintroduce it.
Well, I wasn't quite clear about whether they were talking about surgeries or pharmacies.
They were talking about both, actually.
Yes, well, I certainly think that pharmacies and pharmacists are an underused resource in the NHS. We could use them much more. And when I was a health minister, we published a pharmacy white paper, which was revolutionary in terms of how we wanted pharmacies and pharmacists' roles to expand. My problem is that when this government brought in the reorganisation that the doctor referred to and gave all of the power to commissioning to GPs, my worry is that that has led to pharmacists losing out in terms of the services that they're now providing, and they're obviously under financial pressure as a result.
Wiiliam, do you think special support, financial support, should be given to doctors or pharmacists in rural areas?
Yes, clearly. And actually, I happened to see some advertisements the other day, which was in reference to A&E, saying A&E is for emergencies, and please go and see either your GP or your pharmacist if you possibly can.
You need to have that option.
But you do need to have that option, exactly as you said. And what is worrying about this is that there's been yet another top-down reorganisation by the coalition government. And of course, the outcomes of it seem to be rather against people's interest, actually.
Neil, the thing I'm interested in is you're obviously, like a lot of rural Conservative MPs, a great campaigner for rural funding and against rural underfunding. This looks like a Conservative-led government stripping out support for rural areas which Labour put in, which is a bit embarrassing, isn't it?
I think we haven't actually made the final decision on it. I think we'll have to also balance up to make sure that there are pharmacies within a reasonable distance. Otherwise, you cannot actually shut down small rural ones if people have got to go miles for the next one because of bus services and others not necessarily being available. So I think we've got to look at much more detail. I mean, naturally, one of the problems is that the figures that are done on the numbers and throughputs. And also, I think it's something else that I think we must, and I'm sure people do use them in rural areas, but I think it's a bit like the post offices as well. I think we've got to encourage people actually to go in there and use them more and more, because otherwise they don't get the income. So it's a combination of what can be put in there in public support, but also, you know, from public funds, but also what people can do and actually go in there and use the pharmacy also.
OK, time now for a regular roundup of the political week in just 60 seconds. Plymouth is set to be the first place in the UK to combine health and social care under a single budget. In this case, one of more than £460 million.
We'll be able to take pressure off a very stretched system by facilitating discharges from hospital earlier, and also by preventing admissions to hospital in the first place. And by doing those two things, we think that we're going to get best value for money for our patients and actually save very stretched public money and resources.
Apples are at the centre of a new row with Europe. There are concerns smaller cider producers may be put out of business if the European Commission gets its way on axing tax breaks introduced in Britain.
It would add extra cost and it would never be worth the while doing it. Really pack up, certainly.
And Newquay Airport has made it onto the shortlist as a possible location for a spaceport. It will be a hub for launching satellites and commercial flights. Ben Bradshaw, well-known cider champion and EU champion. How do you square the two things?
Well, I suspect this is another of these UKIP scare stories about the wicked Brussels doing these terrible things. Look, we saw off the attempt to stop us using cider brandy, which you remember was a challenge. We saw off David Cameron's mad idea of a minimum unit price, which would have killed our Farmgate cider industry, and I'm sure we'll see this one off as well.
A UKIP plot, Wiiliam.
Well, it's on the Commission website, but it actually demonstrates two things. One is just how much power we've ceded to the EU Commission, and secondly, which wasn't in the film, the rationalisation for doing this is the single market. And so, as I said last time I was on your programme, the single market is very often used as a kind of Trojan horse and a rationalisation excuse for greater uniformity.
OK, bring in an MP born in the heart.
I could say, being a Somerset man and a Somerset farmer originally, we've got to have cider. I also think it's hands off from the Commission, because duty and tax on things like cider or wine or anything else, countries across Europe have got huge variation. So what on earth they're doing interfering in this? So hands off our cider. That's the issue.
OK, that's it for the Sunday Politics in the South West. Now back to Andrew Neil in London.